All right, we pick up with women. Video 4. Women were initially kept from the polls more from a paternalistic concern than by intimidation, as were blacks. So, what do we mean by paternalistic? Fatherly. If you look at the time, politics was a dirty business. It was just even more than politics was a dirty business. Back in those days, everything was much more physical. If you wanted to dig a ditch, you didn't get a backhoe and scoop that thing out in a matter of mere minutes. If it was a small ditch, or even if it was a long ditch, you could do it all in a day, a very long ditch. You did it by pick and shovel. Those were the days where this historical reality had come from. Politics was seen as a dirty, harsh business, and so women were kept out of it from this paternalistic concern. If you've ever seen the movie The Mask of Zorro, it was the first Zorro with Antonio Banderas. There is a scene. Let me give you a little more history. In The Mask of Zorro, Zorro is kind of a hereditary position where there's one Zorro, he gets old, he gives the mask to the new Zorro. So Antonio Banderas, he's the new Zorro. The previous Zorro, when he was younger, his daughter was stolen by this scoundrel Spaniard, elitist Spaniard, because the guy who became Zorro was able to marry the woman this guy wanted to marry, and so he steals the daughter. He comes back to Mexico after having gone to Spain. Now the daughter is a mature woman, and there's this new Zorro who wants to make things right. And he is in disguise, and he's at a dinner with the Juans, and they begin talking politics. And one Juan is saying one thing, and another Juan is saying another thing. And then the new Zorro speaks up and says something. Of course, they don't know he's the new Zorro. And then this daughter, this kidnapped daughter that this guy has stolen, she speaks up, and you can tell in his expression that he's flustered. And after he's done speaking, after she's done speaking, he says, "A woman's grasp of politics. What can I say?" And of course, all the ones laugh, and that's just how it is, and that's how it was seen in those days. That it was just politics was a man's business. But nevertheless, tireless women had worked for it, and finally, in 1920, they passed the 19th Amendment, and the size of the American electorate doubled overnight. And this is a meaningful doubling. Women were no longer intimidated. Women were not kept from the polls, even though they had the right, like African Americans were. So the size of the electorate doubles overnight. Now, initially, women voted commensurate with their husband. That's just how it was. Most of them thought what their husband thought. So whether their husband was Democrat or Republican, they tended to view things the same way. Even today, that ideology survey I gave you, if you look at that, you should hang on to that. And when you're really interested in somebody, you should give that ideology survey to them. You really want somebody who thinks, politically speaking, a lot like you. Otherwise, you'll be surprised at how many disputes or confrontations you'll get into over little policy quibbles, but that's up to you, of course. Now, today, women are no longer necessarily voting commensurate with their husband. There's that gender gap that we talked about in the last week's lecture that generally supports women's causes today. And so because of that, that has had an impact on American elections today and policies as well. In addition to the 19th and 15th Amendment, another major extension of voting rights was the 26th Amendment. This gave 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. So before the 26th Amendment, you had to be 21 to vote. You might ask yourself why. Why did you have to be 21 to vote? Again, this idea of presentism. When we look at our current standard, well, you only got to be 18 to vote. Well, back in those days, it was just 21. That was their adulthood. Even today, if you look at drinking, you've still got to be 21. You still got to be 21. So there are certain things where there's almost a graduate adulthood that you've got to be there. So why then, if this is the case, if 18, 19, and 20-year-olds were ineligible to vote, why did we ever change it? Think about that for a second, and then you can answer the question why we changed it. Well, the reason we changed it was because the Vietnam War. This was the argument that was made. If I have the duty to die for my country, I ought to be able to vote for the people who send me off to die. This was the argument, and it was a good argument. So at the time in the late 1960s, early 1970s, this was the argument that began to be made by those individuals and those people who could be sent off to war. The 70s were a very turbulent time, politically speaking. And this is the argument they made, that if they had the obligation to potentially get drafted and go off to die and potentially die for the country, then they ought to be able to vote for those individuals who might send them to do that. It's a powerful argument. The pre-Vietnam view of that was parents voted their kids' interests. The parents knew this and therefore took that in consideration in their voting. If they thought something was unjust, a war was unjust, they certainly wouldn't vote for an individual who thought it was just. But with the Vietnam era, this was no longer seen as legitimate. And we passed the 26th Amendment, giving 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. The ironic thing with 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, they just don't vote as often as others. So here they have this right, but they don't avail themselves of it. We'll talk more about that hopefully later on. So, voting. As we said early on, voting is the most common form of political participation. But there are other forms of political participation, and one political scientist had an interesting question. He thought, I wonder on some of these other issues if people are telling us the truth about how often they engage in these other forms of political participation. So he decided he would take something that we knew. We knew how many people voted, and he'd go out there and conduct a poll to find out how many people claimed they had voted in a given election. And then his argument was, let's see if what people are claiming they're doing is what's actually happening. And so in a particular presidential election, 56% of the population voted, of the voting age population voted. But in this survey that was conducted, in this poll that was conducted, 72% claimed to have voted. His conclusion was that if people lie about their participation in voting, they are likely to lie about other forms of political participation. So we have to take how often people claim they engage in these other forms of political participation with a grain of salt, because they are probably exaggerated, was the conclusion of the study. So, again, what are some of these other forms of political participation? Your book talks about conventional and unconventional. Some of the conventional voting, as we stated many times already, it's by far the most common. Contacting public officials. Some of us do that. I've done it a couple times. Write letters to the editors. I've done it a couple times. That's it, though. I'm 58. I've only done it twice. Participate in campaigns. I've given money to only one cause, never to a given candidate. I don't know that I'm proud of that. I don't know that I'm not, but there was this one cause I felt strongly about, and I won't tell you what it was. I'll just let you imagine that for yourselves. Might offend some if I tell. Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to do that. So these are forms of conventional participation. They're legitimate. There's no question to them that these are part of the normal political process. Your book makes the distinction that maybe some others are a little non-conventional, not necessarily part of the legitimate, acceptable means to participate politically. And we give you two examples here. Protest. When individuals protest, is this a means whereby we should seek to change our system or influence the system? It's at best non-conventional. Certainly people do it. They don't do it that often, but then on the other hand, they do it when they feel strongly about it. Civil disobedience, same kind of idea. You see the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King and those who followed him made wonderful use of civil disobedience to change public policy and change the views of Americans in the United States. Terrorism. Your book raises this question. Is terrorism one of these non-conventional forms of participation or not? And the answer is no. The answer is no, definitely not. Terrorism is out of bounds for sure. You just should not fly airplanes into World Trade Centers, knock them down, because you're trying to make a political statement or influence policy. That is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. That is not participation at all. That is terrorism, what the book argues. I would agree, without doubt. All right. So causes of participation. What causes somebody to participate as opposed to not participate? So the individuals who have a college education tend to participate more than individuals who don't have a college education. Individuals who are 35 tend to participate more than individuals who are 34 and below. There's almost something magical about 35. If I had to make a guess, it's probably because a person is well established in their career, they've got the time, they're not working odd jobs that might be during voting time, and so people who are 35 and above just tend to participate more. Religious involvement increases political participation. Religions often talk about how important it is and say you ought to do your civic duty. Whites participate more than blacks. Blacks participate more than Hispanics, with this exception: blacks that have a high socioeconomic status participate more than the average white. So a well-educated African American is going to participate more than even whites. Men and women participate at about the same rate. Special issues with respect to elections. Recall. Some definitional things here. Recall is when citizens can remove an elected official. So when Governor Gray Davis was removed by the California voters and Arnold Schwarzenegger took his place, that was by use of the recall. A referendum is a direct vote by the people to void an existing law. And an initiative is a direct vote by the people to create a law. So in California law, the voters used an initiative to create the three strikes law, which says if you commit 3 serious felonies, you're going to be put in jail to 25 years to life. That was created by an initiative. After so many years, some of the people thought it wasn't working like it should be. They didn't realize it would be that harsh. And so there was a referendum in an attempt to void this existing law, but the referendum failed and the 3 strikes law is still in place today. That's it. Political participation. I hope that was informative, and that is a wrap.